Wouldn't miss it, the judge replied. As they walked out together, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, both men knew that their story would continue through each officer in that classroom, through each traffic stop, through each moment when someone chose understanding over assumption, conversation over confrontation, humanity over fear. 3 years passed like pages turning in a book, each day writing new chapters in the story that began with a simple traffic stop. The officer, now wearing sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, stood before a room full of fresh-faced police academy recruits. The morning sun streamed through the classroom windows, catching the silver in his badge. "Before we start today's training," he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I want to tell you a story about a traffic stop that changed my life." His eyes swept across the room, taking in the eager faces before him. These young men and women reminded him of himself at their age, full of certainty about right and wrong, about good guys and bad guys. At the back of the room, sitting quietly and observing, was the judge. His presence wasn't announced. He preferred it that way. He watched as the officer, his friend now, after all these years, shared their story with a new generation of law enforcement officers. "I thought I knew everything about being a good cop," the sergeant continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "I had the training, the experience, the instincts. But what I didn't have was understanding." He paused, letting that sink in. "I didn't know how much I didn't know until one evening when I pulled over a black Mercedes." The recruits leaned forward in their seats as he described that night, the assumptions he'd made, the way he'd approached the car with his hand near his weapon. He spoke honestly about his biases, about the complaints that had piled up against him, about the wake-up call that came in the form of a judge who chose conversation over confrontation. "You're going to learn a lot in this academy," he said, picking up a piece of chalk. "You'll learn about laws and procedures, about tactical responses and safety protocols." He wrote 3 words on the board: dignity, respect, humanity. "But what I'm going to teach you today is just as important as any of that." In the back of the room, the judge watched as the sergeant shared practical examples from his own experience. He talked about body language, about tone of voice, about the importance of explaining actions and listening to responses. He showed dash cam footage from his traffic stops, the before and after, the stark difference in approaches and outcomes. "Each person you stop is someone's parent, child, friend," the sergeant explained, his voice passionate but controlled. "They have stories you don't know, experiences you haven't lived, fears you might not understand. Your badge gives you authority, but how you use that authority, that's a choice you make every single time." The training session wasn't just theory. The sergeant had developed practical exercises, role-playing scenarios that put recruits in challenging situations. But more importantly, he had them switch roles, experiencing what it felt like to be on the other side of a traffic stop, to feel that uncertainty and vulnerability. During the lunch break, the judge finally made his way to the front of the room. The 2 men shook hands warmly, their greeting that of old friends who had walked a long road together. Around them, recruits whispered as they realized who the quiet observer was, connecting him to the story they'd heard that morning. "Your Honor," one brave recruit approached them, "is it true? Did that traffic stop really happen like that?" The judge smiled, exchanging a glance with the sergeant. "Every word," he replied. "And you know what the most important part of the story is? It's still happening, right here, right now, with all of you." The afternoon session took an unexpected turn when the judge joined the sergeant at the front of the room. Together, they fielded questions from the recruits, honest, sometimes difficult questions about race, authority, justice, and human dignity. The conversation was raw, real, and exactly what these future officers needed to hear. As the day drew to a close, the sergeant looked out at the recruits one last time. "Tomorrow, you'll go back to your regular training. You'll learn how to protect yourselves, how to enforce the law, how to serve your community. But today, I hope you've learned something just as vital: how to see the humanity in every person you encounter, even in the most challenging moments." The judge stayed behind as the recruits filed out, many of them stopping to shake hands with both men. In the empty classroom, he walked up to the chalkboard where those 3 words still stood: dignity, respect, humanity. "You know," he said to the sergeant, "when I invited you for coffee that night, I never imagined it would lead to this." The sergeant nodded, erasing the words slowly. "Neither did I," he admitted. But that's how change works, isn't it? One conversation, one person, one moment at a time. He put down the eraser and turned to his friend. Same time next month. The weeks following their coffee meeting brought changes that neither man could have predicted. The officer found himself sitting in the back of the judge's courtroom during his off-duty hours, watching proceedings with new eyes. The polished wooden benches felt different from this side, and for the first time, he saw the justice system from a different angle. One particular case caught his attention. A young man, barely out of his teens, charged with resisting arrest during a traffic stop. Instead of just sitting defiance in the defendant's posture, the officer noticed the fear beneath it, the same fear he'd glimpsed in countless traffic stops but had never truly acknowledged before. During breaks, the judge would invite him into his chambers. Their conversations continued over paper cups of courthouse coffee, not quite as bad as the diner's brew but close. They talked about what the officer observed in court, about patterns they both recognized, about small changes that could make big differences. "You know what I noticed today?" the officer said during one of these talks, turning his coffee cup thoughtfully in his hands. "When you speak to defendants, you look them in the eye, really look at them. I've been trying that during my stops lately." He paused, then added, "It changes things. People respond differently when they feel seen." The judge nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Small changes can have big ripples," he said. "How are those complaint numbers looking?" There was no judgment in his voice, just genuine interest. The officer smiled slightly. 3 weeks without a single complaint. My sergeant actually pulled me aside yesterday to ask what changed. He looked down at his hands, then back up. I told him about our coffee meeting, about what I learned. He wants to know if you consider speaking at our next department training day. But the changes weren't just professional. The officer found himself noticing things he'd overlooked before, the way elderly residents in the neighborhood waved to him now, how kids didn't suddenly stop playing when his patrol car drove by. He'd started parking his car and walking his beat more often, learning names, hearing stories. The judge watched these transformations with quiet satisfaction. During one afternoon session, he glanced up to see the officer in his usual spot, taking notes. But this time, there was a younger officer beside him, listening intently as his colleague pointed out details about the proceedings, explaining things in low whispers. Word spread through the department. Other officers began showing up to observe court sessions. The judge's chambers became a place of informal mentorship, where cops and court officers could talk openly about their challenges and fears, about better ways to serve their community. The officer's traffic stops changed dramatically. He still pulled people over, it was part of his job, but his approach was different. He listened more, explained more, connected more. His body camera footage from these stops began being used in training sessions as examples of good community policing. One evening, about 2 months after their first coffee meeting, the officer pulled over another black Mercedes. But this time, everything was different. He approached with respect, not suspicion. His hand stayed far from his weapon. The driver, an elderly woman coming home from church, ended up thanking him for his courtesy even though he gave her a warning for a broken taillight. Later that night, he sat in his patrol car typing up his daily reports. His sergeant's words from months ago came back to him. "You're a good cop, but you need to work on your people skills." He smiled, realizing how much truth had been in those words and how much he'd learned since then. The judge, too, saw changes in his courtroom. Officers who testified seemed more thoughtful in their responses, more aware of the impact their words and actions had on people's lives. The tension that often filled his courtroom during cases involving law enforcement began to ease, replaced by something that felt more like mutual respect. But perhaps the most significant change was in the conversations that started happening throughout the department. Officers began talking openly about their biases, their fears, their desire to do better. The wall of silence that often separated police from the community they served started showing cracks, letting in light and fresh air. The officer kept his regular spot in the courtroom gallery, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Each case became a lesson, each session a reminder of why he'd become a police officer in the first place, to serve, to protect, to make a difference in people's lives. The diner looked exactly like it had for the past 30 years, a small, square building with large windows and a neon sign that flickered slightly in the early morning light. At 6:55 a.m., the judge sat in a corner booth, 2 empty coffee cups on the table before him. He'd arrived early, unsure if the officer would actually show up. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 7 a.m. The officer walked in, still in his civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the same alert posture he had on duty. Their eyes met across the diner, and for a moment, both men remembered the tension of the previous night. But this was a new day, and the morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to wash away the shadows of their first encounter. "Good morning, Your Honor," the officer said, sliding into the booth. The vinyl seat squeaked slightly under his weight. The waitress appeared almost immediately, coffee pot in hand, her practiced movements suggesting she'd done this dance 1,000 times before. "Please," the judge said, watching as steam rose from their fresh cups, "let's leave the titles at the door. This isn't my courtroom, and you're not on patrol." He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. "This is just two men having a conversation." The officer nodded, reaching for the sugar packets. The familiar routine of preparing coffee gave him something to do with his hands, which suddenly felt awkward. "I've been thinking about last night," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "About why I really pulled you over." The judge watched him carefully, seeing not the uniform from last night, but a younger man struggling with truths he'd never been asked to examine before. "Let's start somewhere easier," he suggested. "Tell me about why you became a police officer." That question opened a door. The officer spoke about growing up in a tough neighborhood, about wanting to make a difference, about the ideals he carried into the academy. His coffee grew cold as he talked about his first years on the force, the reality of the job slowly replacing those early ideals. The judge listened, really listened, the way he'd learned to do over decades on the bench. When the officer finished, he shared his own story, growing up in the segregated South, the daily indignities, the determination to succeed despite them. He talked about his first traffic stop as a young law student, how it had shaped his view of justice. "I remember thinking," the judge said, pushing his empty plate aside, "that if I ever made it to a position of influence, I'd try to bridge these gaps, not with speeches or programs, but one conversation at a time." The morning light had grown stronger, casting long shadows across their table. The officer leaned forward, his face serious. "Can I ask you something?" When the judge nodded, he continued, "How do you not get angry? After everything you've experienced, how do you stay so calm?" The judge smiled slightly. "Who says I'm not angry?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The trick isn't to not feel anger. It's to use it as fuel for change, rather than letting it burn you up inside." Their conversation flowed naturally after that. They talked about their families, their hopes for their community, the changes they'd seen, and the ones they still wanted to see. The officer shared his struggles with the job, the split-second decisions, the weight of wearing the badge. The judge spoke about similar pressures in the courtroom, where his decisions affected lives just as dramatically. Other diners came and went around them. The waitress refilled their cups without asking, somehow sensing the importance of their conversation. The morning sun climbed higher, but neither man noticed the time passing. They were too engrossed in a dialogue that was becoming more honest, more real with each passing minute. "You know," the officer said, staring into his fourth cup of coffee, "my surgeon's been telling me I need to change my approach during traffic stops. But until last night, I didn't really understand what he meant." He looked up at the judge. "Thank you for not just getting angry, for offering this instead." The judge nodded, understanding the courage it took to admit such things. "Change starts with recognition," he said, "but it continues with action. The question is, what happens tomorrow? And the day after that?" As they prepared to leave, both men realized that something significant had shifted. The divide that had seemed so wide the night before had narrowed, not completely, but enough to allow understanding to flow across it. They stood outside the diner in the full morning light, two men who had started as symbols of their positions, but had become something more, people who had chosen to see each other's humanity. The officer stood there, flashlight beam still pointed at the ground, processing what had just happened. The weight of the judge's identification felt heavy in his hand. 8 years on the force had trained him for many situations, but not for this one. Not for a simple traffic stop turning into a moment that would make him question everything he thought he knew. "Coffee?" He repeated, the word coming out almost like a question to himself. The night had grown quieter around them, as if the universe itself was waiting for his answer. Through the car window, he could see the judge's face clearly now, calm, dignified, but with eyes that held decades of stories he suddenly wanted to hear. Yes, coffee, the judge confirmed, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his courtroom. There's a diner just 2 blocks from here. They open early, say, 7 a.m. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding. The invitation hung in the air like a bridge being extended across a deep divide. The officer's mind raced back to his earlier conversation with the sergeant, about his approach to traffic stops, about the complaints. He thought about his own family, about the lessons his mother had taught him about respect and dignity. Something inside him shifted, like a key turning in a lock he didn't know existed. 7 a.m., he found himself saying, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. I know the place. He handed back the judge's documents, noticing for the first time how his own hands had relaxed, no longer hovering near his weapon. The atmosphere had changed completely from the tense moments of just minutes ago. The judge took his ID and badge, tucking them carefully back into his wallet. Sometimes, he said, looking directly at the officer, the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected places. He paused, then added with a slight smile, and over really bad diner coffee. That small joke, so human and unexpected, broke through the last of the official barriers between them. The officer felt a laugh escape before he could stop it, not a nervous laugh, but a genuine one. It felt like releasing a breath he'd been holding for too long. I should warn you, Your Honor, the officer said, his voice finding a new, more natural tone. I actually like their coffee. It was a small thing, this exchange about coffee preferences, but it felt like the first real human connection he'd made during a traffic stop in years. The judge nodded, appreciating the moment for what it was, not just an end to a tense situation, but the beginning of something new. Then you'll have to explain to me what I'm missing, he replied. But for now, I think we've both given our neighbors enough to talk about for one evening. The officer stepped back from the car, straightening his posture. But this time, it wasn't the rigid stance of authority he usually maintained. Instead, it was the posture of someone who had just agreed to step into unknown territory, someone who had chosen to be brave in a different way than his training had taught him. Drive safely, Your Honor, he said, the words carrying a new weight of respect, not just for the judge's position, but for the man himself and the opportunity he had offered. The judge nodded in acknowledgement, and both men knew that tomorrow's conversation would be about much more than coffee. As the officer walked back to his patrol car, his boots crunching on the gravel seemed to echo with each step. The night air felt different somehow, charged with possibility. He watched in his rearview mirror as the black Mercedes pulled away smoothly, its taillights disappearing around the corner. Sitting in his patrol car, he didn't immediately start the engine. Instead, he took a moment to write down the time and location of tomorrow's meeting, though he knew he wouldn't forget. His report for this traffic stop would be unlike any other he'd ever filed, not because of what had happened, but because of what was about to happen. The dashboard clock showed it was barely past 8 in the evening, but somehow it felt like the beginning of a new day. Tomorrow at 7, 2 men would sit down over coffee, not as officer and judge, but as human beings ready to share their stories, their perspectives, their truths. And maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference. The first words through the open window set the tone for everything that followed. License and registration, the officer demanded, not even bothering with the customary good evening. His flashlight beam swept across the car's interior, lingering perhaps a moment too long on the driver's face. The judge took a deep breath, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. He'd been here before, not in this exact spot, but in this situation. The familiar mix of emotions washed over him, frustration, anger, and beneath it all, a deep tiredness. But decades on the bench had taught him the power of staying calm in tense moments. Officer, he began, his voice steady and clear, I'd like to know why I've been pulled over. The question was simple, direct, and completely within his rights to ask. But something in the officer's stance stiffened, as if the mere question was a challenge to his authority. I'll ask the questions here, the officer replied, his tone sharp. License and registration, now. The flashlight beam didn't waver, creating harsh shadows across both their faces. Through the glare, the judge could see the officer's free hand resting near his weapon, a detail that made his heart beat faster despite years of experience handling difficult situations. "I understand, officer," the judge responded, maintaining his composure. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now. It's in my back pocket." He narrated his movements carefully, the way his father had taught him decades ago, the way he'd sadly had to teach his own son. Each gesture was slow, deliberate, non-threatening. The leather of his wallet felt cool in his hands as he withdrew his identification. Years of premium cards, business cards, and family photos were tucked behind his driver's license and his judicial badge. He noticed his hands weren't shaking. They never did anymore in these situations. Experience had taught him that fear wasn't as useful as clarity. As he handed over his documents, the judge watched the officer's face carefully. He'd seen that expression countless times in his courtroom, the moment when assumptions collided with reality. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as the officer processed what he was seeing: a driver's license, a judicial badge, and a man who didn't fit the profile he'd expected. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with unspoken words. The officer cleared his throat, his demeanor shifting subtly. "Your Honor, he began, but the judge raised his hand slightly, not in anger, but in a gesture learned from years of courtroom experience. "Officer," the judge said quietly, "we both know why you pulled me over. And we both know it wasn't about any traffic violation." The words hung in the air between them, honest but not accusatory. The judge continued, his voice taking on the same tone he used when mentoring young lawyers. "But right now, we have an opportunity." The officer's flashlight finally lowered, its beam pointing at the ground. In the softer light, both men could see each other more clearly. The judge noticed the officer's name tag, his relatively new uniform, the slight uncertainty now visible in his stance. The officer saw a man who could have easily pulled rank, who could have made this stop into a major incident, choosing instead to take a different approach. "Would you join me for coffee tomorrow morning?" the judge asked, surprising both himself and the officer. Not as a judge and an officer, but as two people who might have something to learn from each other. The invitation was genuine, offered without malice or hidden agenda. The night air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the officer's response. In that moment, both men stood at a crossroads. One path led to continued misunderstanding and division, the other towards something neither of them could fully see yet, but both could sense might be important. The dashboard camera continued recording silently, capturing what would later be recognized as a pivotal moment in both their lives. Sometimes, the judge would later reflect, the most significant changes start not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with simple moments of human connection, like an unexpected invitation on a dark evening by the side of the road. The police officer sat in his patrol car, parked in a quiet spot where the street curved around a small park. He'd been with the force for 8 years now, and this neighborhood had become like a second home during his evening shifts. His coffee, now lukewarm in its cup holder, had barely been touched. His mind was elsewhere tonight. Earlier that day, his sergeant had pulled him aside for what they called a performance discussion. Too many complaints about his approach during traffic stops, they said. Too aggressive, too confrontational. The sergeant's words still rang in his ears. "You're a good cop, but you need to work on your people skills." He'd nodded, promised to do better, but inside, defensiveness burned like a slow flame. His dashboard computer glowed softly in the growing darkness, casting a blue tint across his face. He'd been watching cars pass by, mostly residents heading home from work. Each face behind each windshield told a different story, he thought, though lately he'd been seeing more threats than stories. The black Mercedes caught his eye as it made a turn ahead of him. Something about it triggered an instinct, or was it a prejudice, that he'd developed over his years on the force. The car was too nice for this neighborhood, he told himself, though deep down he knew that wasn't true anymore. The area had changed a lot since he'd first started patrolling here. His hand moved almost automatically to the light bar control. As he pulled out to follow the Mercedes, he ran through his usual mental checklist. License plate visible? Check. All lights working? Check. Any obvious violations? He hesitated here. There weren't any, but he already committed to the stop. Following the car, he noticed how perfectly it maintained the speed limit, how precisely it signaled each turn. This made him more suspicious, not less. In his experience, he told himself, people who drove that carefully often had something to hide. The thought helped quiet the small voice in his head, questioning his real reasons for making this stop. The patrol car's computer automatically activated his body camera as he flipped on the lights. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, showing none of the panic or jerky movements he usually associated with guilty drivers. This should have relaxed him, but instead, he felt his guard rise even higher. As he stepped out of his cruiser, his right hand instinctively brushed his weapon, a habit formed in training and reinforced by years of what they called tactical awareness. The evening air had cooled considerably, but he barely noticed. His focus had narrowed to the task at hand, his senses heightened as they always would during traffic stops. His boots crunched slightly on the gravel at the road's edge as he approached the Mercedes. Through the tinted rear window, he could make out a single figure in the driver's seat, male, well-dressed from what he could see. The interior light had come on automatically, which was good, but he still kept his flashlight ready. The scene was picture-perfect for a routine traffic stop: good lighting, quiet street, clear visibility. Yet something felt different about this one. Maybe it was the earlier conversation with his sergeant, or maybe it was something else, something deeper that he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He took those final steps toward the driver's window with the confident stride he perfected over years of similar stops. His face had already settled into what his fellow officers jokingly called his authority mask: stern, unsmiling, brooking no argument. He'd found it worked better that way, establishing control from the first moment. What he didn't realize was that this stop would be different from any other in his career. In the next few minutes, his entire worldview would be challenged, though not in the way he might have expected. As he reached the driver's window, his flashlight beam ready to pierce the gathering darkness, he had no idea he was about to meet someone who would change his life forever. The sun was setting over the city skyline as the respected judge made his way home from another long day at the courthouse. His black Mercedes glided smoothly along the familiar streets of his neighborhood, where he built his life over the past 20 years. The leather seats still had that subtle new car smell, even after 3 years of ownership. He'd worked hard for this car, this life, earning every bit of success through dedication and perseverance. The day had been particularly challenging, filled with complex cases that tested his patience and wisdom. A custody battle had left him emotionally drained, the pain in both parents' eyes still fresh in his mind. But that was the weight of wearing the robes, carrying other people's burdens while maintaining the balance of justice. As he drove, his thoughts wandered to his own journey. From a small town where his family had little, to putting himself through law school working 2 jobs, to finally ascending to the bench. Each step had been a lesson in determination. The golden light of dusk painted the trees along the street, reminding him of those early days when he'd walk miles to the library, dreaming of a future where he could make a difference. The neighborhood around him had changed too. What was once a predominantly white suburb had grown into a vibrant, diverse community. He'd watched families move in and out, children grow up, and gardens bloom and fade with the seasons. His own house, a modest but elegant 2-story colonial, stood as a testament to the American dream he'd pursued relentlessly. Traffic was light this evening, just a few cars heading home like him, everyone lost in their own thoughts of dinner plans and family time. He adjusted his tie, slightly loosened after hours in the courtroom, and checked his watch. His wife would be waiting with dinner. Thursday was always her special recipe night, a tradition they'd kept alive through decades of marriage. The radio played softly in the background, a gentle jazz piece that matched the peaceful mood of his drive. He'd always found these moments alone in his car therapeutic, a chance to decompress and transition from judge to just being himself. His briefcase sat heavy with cases to review over the weekend, but for now, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the drive. As he approached the intersection near his community center, he noticed how the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, creating pools of light on the darkening pavement. The air conditioning hummed quietly, keeping the early autumn heat at bay. Everything felt normal, routine, safe, the kind of evening that usually blended seamlessly into hundreds of others in memory. He smiled, thinking about tomorrow's docket. A young man was scheduled to appear before him, someone who reminded him of himself at that age, eager, determined, maybe a little rough around the edges but full of potential. These were the cases he lived for, where he could possibly guide someone toward a better path. The Mercedes' engine purred as he made a careful turn, following all traffic rules as he always did. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Excellence isn't just about the big moments, it's about how you handle yourself when nobody's watching. He'd lived by those words, teaching them to his own children and applying them to every aspect of his life. Little did he know that this ordinary Thursday evening was about to become anything but routine. In his rearview mirror, the first flash of red and blue lights appeared, and with it, a familiar sinking feeling in his stomach, one he'd hoped he'd never have to feel again.